Hi, thanks for listening. Before we get started, please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all of the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube, the Reddit stuff, and Substack, as well as the quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. Make sure you give us that big 5-star rating, big thumbs up, sharing what we're putting out there with all your friends and family. Leaving us a comment, telling us what you would like us to talk about in terms of topics related to exercise, diet, or any of the other types of myths and misconceptions you might have about how the human body works or how to go about being healthy. I was passed along an article looking at the idea about processed food and also ultra processed food and whether or not we are addressing the topics the way that we should be addressing it, and how we can go about recommending healthy diets, or how health professionals can recommend healthy diets, or how we can talk with our healthcare professionals about healthy diets so that we do not fall into the bias traps that tends to kind of guide a lot of discussions as it relates to diet and exercise, particularly diet and exercise by the healthcare professionals. And so the discussion is going to focus on two key concepts here. First key concept is what is processed foods and why processed foods might not be healthy. And then how can we go about scoring our diet to understand whether or not our diet is actually healthy or not. So, are we actually following a healthy diet, or are we simply thinking we're following a healthy diet? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning! The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
So the gist of the discussion here stems from an article that's passed on to me based off of a synopsis of a review and a presentation at a nutrition conference that took place just a couple weeks ago in late June, early July of 2024, that basically looked at how do we go about scoring processed food in terms of being unprocessed food, low processed food, more processed food, or ultra processed food. And how does that scoring of processing of foods relate to all the various non-communicable health diseases that we're trying to combat with diet and with exercise, with modification of lifestyle? And so a lot of this stems from what we think about as the clean eating trend that is consuming a lot of the primary food discussions that are out there. The fact that simple ingredients suggest that we're consuming less processed foods, or consuming foods that have fewer amounts of processed foods within it. And that is a prerequisite for having a healthy diet. But the problem is that we can't really justify that idea, that statement, in terms of clean eating, simply because we don't have a universally accepted definition for what clean eating is, nor do we have a universally accepted definition for what amounts of processing takes place within foods to make it less processed food, more processed food, or ultra processed foods. A lot of times this idea about clean eating stems from the idea of a Western diet versus a non-Western diet, stems from the idea of the labeling that takes place within foods, where we have labels that will present a lot of the scientific nomenclature, the scientific words, to describe words that are, or describe molecules that we have common language terms for. And so we have these two kind of ideas at play when relate to what the gist of the article was presenting and what the reviews were actually talking about within this article that was passed on to me that we're discussing here today. And so when we start looking at the idea about processed foods, what we're really talking about is we're talking about how much refinement has taken place within the foods. And this is where we have to look at the way in which we index the foods. And there's two key indexes that most nutrition researchers look at, which is either the NOVA food classification or the HEI classification. And so when we start looking at HEI and we start looking at HEI, or Healthy Eating Index, and we look at the NOVA food classification system, what we're really discussing how much processing of the food took place from the time it was harvested to the time that it was actually on the plate and eaten. And it's this processing that a lot of the clean eating advocates will discuss and indicate as taking healthy food and making it unhealthy. What we're really looking at, we're looking at this idea about processing and taking unprocessed food or quote unquote natural food and turning it into low processed food, more processed food, or ultra processed food. What we're really looking at is we're looking at what is the likelihood for that molecule, for the actual food molecules, to take on the characteristics of being either a metabolic disruptor or an endocrine disruptor, if we're looking at it as being part of the continuum of factors that can have a negative impact on overall health within that continuum of fitness and fatness factors that are going to be the contributors to the non-communicable diseases. And so the real idea here in terms of what's being presented in these articles is that if we were to look at the foods as the key culprit in all of the cogs that lead to the non-communicable disease, even though we know that's not necessarily the case because it's a highly complex issue. But if the food was one of the major contributing factors, what the idea within this kind of clean eating advocacy is that the more processed the food becomes, the more likely that food is to take on the characteristics of being a metabolic disruptor. And if it's taking on the characteristics of being a metabolic disruptor, it's going to increase the relative risk for having a non-communicable disease. And once again, it's all about the relative risk. It doesn't necessarily mean that simply because we're consuming processed foods, we're automatically going to have disease. We're automatically going to have non-communicable disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, those kinds of factors, or those kinds of diseases coming about simply because of consuming processed foods. It's the idea that we increase the relative risk simply because of the exposure to metabolic disruptors. We've previously discussed metabolic disruptors. Place links in the description to both the YouTube video on metabolic disruptors as well as the discussion that we've had previously on metabolic disruptors if you wish to go back and either watch the lecture video or re-listen to the discussion that we had here on the podcast. And so when we start looking at this idea about processing, we have to look at the scoring that comes out from the processed foods. And the scoring that comes out from the processed foods is based off of the NOVA system, the NOVA classification system. And the NOVA classification system is going to be give us basically group categorizations. And the group categorizations tells us how much processing has taken place that will allow us to determine what is the likelihood for that substance to possibly have metabolic disruptive capacity in it. This is where we're going to have 4 distinct group levels. The group 1 is going to be our unprocessed or our quote unquote natural foods. These are going to be foods that are obtained directly from the plant or from the animal and do not undergo any type of alteration, do not go any type of chemical reaction in the production of that food stuff. The other way of looking at this unprocessed food is also looking at it in terms of being a minimally processed food. The minimally processed food is a food that has had some sort of cleansing to it, where inedible or unwanted parts of the food have been removed, allowing for the food to be edible or allowing for the part of the food that we would normally eat to be available. Nothing is added in this process. There may be some subtraction. There may be some pasteurization. There may be some fermenting. There may be some extraction, but we don't add anything to it. There's no preservations taking place. There's no addition of fats, sugars, salts, or substances in a curative nature to it. We then get the processed foods. And with the processed foods, we get the less processed foods. And these less processed foods have small amounts of additives to it. These are also slightly processed foods. So these are foods that have been procured through the process of things like pressing and grinding and pulverizing and refining in single step or double step process where we're not doing large amounts of processing to the food. We'll find these foods in some of the prepared foods that we might buy at the store: oils, butter, lard, sugars, those kinds of substances. We then get to the more processed foods. The more processed foods is the processed foods that have had additional processing to it. These are things that have been preserved. These are things that have had stuff added to them to make them more palatable. These are things that have had stuff added to them in order to allow them to have longer shelf lives. The more processed foods lead to the ultra processed foods. The ultra processed foods are the industrialized foodstuffs. These are going to be foods that are made from foods that undergo the less processing and the more processing, or even comprised of foods that combine multiple types of the natural or the unprocessed foods that get modified in terms of the molecular constituents. The ultra processed foods are the foods that we have to worry about in terms of directly acting like metabolic disruptors. These are going to have the modified fat. These are going to have the modified sugars. These can have the various dyes and various chemicals made from hydrocarbons that can act as endocrine disruptors. The manufacturing technique of the ultra processed foods can allow for extension of shelf lives that can act in a way to prevent molding from taking place. A lot of times when we're looking at the ultra processed foods, we're looking at things that have been extruded, things that have been molded in terms of made to look like something. These are things that have been pre-fried in terms of their pre-cooking of the substance. A lot of times we're looking at the ultra processed foods. These are the things that we might find in the vending machines. These are the things that we'll find in any of the bars that we might eat, any of the potato chips we might eat, any of the prepared packaged meals, regardless of how quote unquote natural or whether or not it fits into any of the other dogmatic dietary practices, whether it's vegetarian or vegan or keto or paleo or any of the other labels we might want to put on the diets. They can all have the ultra processing within the foods. As we increase the processing in the foods, we increase the likelihood of having metabolic disruptors within there, in particular the hydrogenated fats, the exposure to the hydrocarbon-based dyes, the modified starches, the inclusion of high amounts of fructose within the starches, the high fructose syrups, which act as metabolic disruptors on adipose functions, the hydrocarbons, which act as both endocrine disruptors as well as metabolic disruptors, that depending upon which hydrocarbon we're looking at in terms of how it is cooked, can have a carcinogenic and immunogenic effect within the body. And so when we start looking at those processing, that processing gives us our NOVA classification in terms of, is it natural? Is it minimally processed? Is it low processed or less processed? Is it more processed? Or is it ultra processed? And for the people that follow the clean eating adage, they're basically going to follow their golden rule. And their golden rule is always prefer the natural or always prefer the minimally processed foods that are fresh and made at home to anything that is more processed or ultra processed. That's the ideal behind the clean eating initiatives, the clean eating kind of movement. And that clean eating movement has kind of pushed a lot of the dietary guidelines that we see being imposed by various types of governmental organizations, which remember is that whether we're looking at the old food pyramid or if we're looking at the current My Plates in terms of the reliance on food groupings and reliance upon types of foods to eat, those ideas come about through committee consensus, not come about through scientific consensus. And this is where we get into this idea of, should we avoid processed foods altogether? Is this idea about clean eating actually beneficial? And that's where we get into the next guideline that's there, and that is what's referred to as the Healthy Eating Index. And the Healthy Eating Index is coming about from these kind of committee consensus ideas. And so what is the Healthy Eating Index, and how can I use that Healthy Eating Index if I want to look at the foods I'm eating and whether or not the foods I'm eating are going to contribute to the non-communicable disease risks by changing the exposure that I might have to metabolic disruption and how that change in metabolic disruption can possibly lead to non-communicable disease. So the Healthy Eating Index is a scoring system that allows people to understand how well their diet is going to align with the dietary guidelines that has been set forth by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so what the Healthy Eating Index is going to do is it's going to allow for the comparison of my diet to what I should be eating based off of the committee consensus and the dietary guidelines that have been published. And
Which
it
means
what I'm
scored off
actually
of
doing
a
really is
percentage score, so
comparing
you have
what is
a
my
0
diet
to
to what
100.
the committee consensus about diet happens to be. If we look at it this way, it's slightly different than what we see from the NOVA scores, where the NOVA score is telling me what is the likelihood for me having some sort of food that might be a metabolic disruptor. The HEI really isn't telling me whether or not I'm having a healthy diet or not. It's simply telling me, how does my diet align with the guidelines for food groupings? How does my diet align with the serving portions that I should be having within each day? And so we can look at this HEI as basically a way to guide us to determine and provide some data, some qualifications and some quantifications to my diet to determine how actual healthy my diet might be if I look at it based off of the serving portion sizes that are being recommended and how those serving portion sizes align with the guidelines that have been set forth by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we look at this Healthy Eating Index based off of two components to it: the adequacy of the foods I'm eating and the moderation of the foods I'm eating. Based off of the maximum scores that we're looking at, we have this breakdown of my fruits in terms of total amount of fruits I'm eating and how much whole fruit I'm eating, my total amount of vegetables I'm eating, the amount of whole grains I'm eating, the amount of beans and nuts that I'm eating, the amount of dairy that I'm eating, the total amount of protein that's being consumed, and whether that protein is coming from animal sources or whether that protein is coming from plant sources or whether that protein is coming from seafood sources. And then what is the total amount of fatty acids that are being consumed? And that's where I'm getting my adequacy score from. My moderation score is coming from how much refined grains am I eating? How much added sugar am I eating? How much saturated fat am I eating? And how much sodium am I eating? When we look at the adequacy scores, what we're really looking at is we're looking at kind of where are the macronutrients coming from. If we're looking at the moderation scores, the moderation score is stemming from, once again, some bad science in terms of the identification of possible contributors to non-communicable diseases that we've previously discussed as it relates to sodium and blood pressure and saturated fats and heart disease and saturated fats and metabolic disease, as well as some leanings towards public opinion as it relates to the concepts of carbohydrates, the concepts of sugars, and the fact that sugars have gotten a bad rap in terms of what we need and how we should go about eating. If we look at this contribution of adequacy and moderation, all of the components that we're using to assess the adequacy and assess the moderation of foods in our diet is based off of ancillary reports as to foods that can contribute to metabolic issues, that can contribute to non-communicable disease issues, that can contribute to cancer issues. And so those are the components within this Healthy Eating Index. So how do we go about using that healthy eating index to help me out in terms of determining whether or not I am having a healthy diet or not? It's going to help me to determine the diet quality based off of the nutrition values that are in the foods themselves. The nutrition values within the foods themselves is not based off of nutrient density. It's not based off of nutrient need. It's based off of serving sizes and servings. That is the serving sizes and servings that I need based off of the committee agreement about diet. The associations that we have with health outcomes, the associations that we have with diet and non-communicable disease, what a lot of people refer to as chronic disease or lifespan disease, cardiovascular disease, overfatness, obesity, cancer, metabolic diseases, bone health issues, neurodegenerative diseases, cognitive diseases, or cancers, along with what's sometimes referred to as all-cause risks for death. We know that the higher the healthy eating index the person has, the lower likelihood they have, the lower associated risk they have for non-communicable disease. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's simply because they're following the dietary guidelines. That doesn't mean that they are better off because they have a high healthy index or high healthy eating index score. We have to remember that we have a highly complex interaction of factors that come into play as relates to what is going to lead to, or what is going to mitigate, what is going to slow down the development of these non-communicable diseases, these developments of these metabolic diseases that elevate the risk for metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, low bone health. What it can do is it can be used as a teaching tool as it relates to evaluating, should I be eating foods that are highly refined, high amounts of fructose-based starches, high amounts of hydrogenated oils, hydrogenated or trans fats, high amounts of foods that have synthetic dyes, foods that have hydrocarbon-based dyes, foods that have pyrolyzed proteins within them. All factors that we know act as metabolic disruptors, all factors that we know have a increased or can cause an increased risk for having metabolic issues that can lead to non-communicable disease that can impact overall lifespan. So what did the research point out in terms of what was covered in the article and why we're discussing it here? The two things that were pointed out by the research is that the processed foods, in terms of being either less processed food or more processed food, tend to have a similar relationship to HEI scores that were in the mid-range, the mid 40s in terms of the HEI index scores that tend to have a slightly lower total amount of energy density within the foods, if we're looking at it in terms of caloric density, which we know is an incorrect way of looking at food, relative to what we would see if we were looking at that same food in an ultra-processed form. And so when we start looking at this comparison in terms of caloric densities within the foods, it's comparison to what the ultra-processed foods would offer to the person. Whereas the ultra-processed foods tended to correspond with HEI scores that were even lower than what was seen with the less processed and the more processed foods that were there. A score that's kind of what we see when we start looking at Western American diet HEI score. The other idea that was looked at in terms of the research review that stemmed into the article was the cost. And that is, how much more expensive was it to eat less processed than it was to eat more processed? And what the researchers pointed out is that based off of the cost per person in a comparison of less processed foods on relative to more processed foods, the less processed foods cost somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 times as much as the more processed foods. The less processed foods and the more processed foods both provided lower total quality diets, that mid 40 points in terms of the HEI. The less processed were more expensive and had shorter overall shelf life, which means they had to be eaten more quickly, even though they had a relatively similar total HEI score, which means that they were both relatively lower in terms of healthy eating index and had a higher associated risk for the non-communicable diseases, looking at nutrition being a key component in that overall ratings for non-communicable disease, with the idea that the review study supports the recommendations to limit total consumption of processed foods. Understanding that it is cost prohibitive to do so, which means that there needs to be some sort of push within the community to make the less processed natural foods, the unprocessed natural foods, more economically feasible for lower income individuals, so as to raise their level of healthiness in their diet. When we start looking at this in terms of how we can go about communicating this idea with our healthcare professional, one of the things we have to look at in terms of this healthy eating index and this NOVA scoring is understanding what is the actual impact that the diet has relative to all of the other impacts that lifestyle have on non-communicable disease. And it's one component of all of the non-communicable disease components. With that in mind, we have to look at it in terms of both the economics of eating quote unquote healthy and the exposure risks that come about from having processed foods. We want to limit the exposure to processed foods so as to minimize the exposure to metabolic disruptors, limit the exposure to hydrocarbons, limit the exposure to pyrolyzed proteins, limit the exposure to refined fats, limit the exposure to trans fats, limit the exposure to high fructose starches, all known to have metabolic disruptive and endocrine disrupting qualities. But at the same time, there are other foods that can be recommended that would score high on the healthy eating index scores that can have issues when we look at it in terms of metabolic risk factors. In particular, we start looking at increased amounts of plant protein, increase the amounts of plants within the diet, the exposure to the anti-nutrients that we've talked about before, but also the fact that a lot of the plant protein sources have phytochemicals in them, phytosterols in particular, that have endocrine disrupting properties that mimic estrogen, that can have an estrifying effect on the body. That while estrifying chemicals can have a protective effect against ROS accumulation, can stimulate antioxidant production, can help with aerobic metabolic functions, can have a can act counter to any type of anabolic effects that we're trying to get from any type of exercise. Any type of exercise that we're looking at for people who have overfatness issues is an attempt to reconstitute anabolic regulation, to take us from an inflammatory state to an anti-inflammatory state, which means that if we're taking and eating foods that have an estrifying effect, if I happen to be male that is low in my androgen signals, that has hypogonadal signals, if I'm consuming things that have an estrifying effect, I'm not going to be able to recoup any type of anabolic signaling by eating those foods, which is where we have to start looking at in totality the impact of the processed foods, the impact of that NOVA scale, with the impact of the HEI scale, along with how the foods might act as metabolic as well as endocrine in terms of their signaling within the body, allowing me to have a rebound towards health, a rebound towards healthiness. So what's the take-home message that was given from the article? What's the take-home message given from the review articles that were there? The take-home message from both the article that was summarizing the review articles as well as the foods that quote unquote should be avoided is that we need to look at not necessarily the processing of the foods as being the things that we want to avoid. That is, how processed that food happens to be, as the end all be all to what foods to avoid in terms of foods to eat, foods not to eat, as in regards to that one component in all of the components as relates to the non-communicable disease. The more processed, the quality of the processing, and the quality of the research that we have towards understanding the impact that processing has on our metabolism and on our overall health is limited right now, because we don't have commonality in our expression of what is processed, what is non-processed, what is natural, what is not natural, what is processed fortified, what is just natural, what is the purpose of having a fortified product, something that we mentioned in a brief take that was posted onto Instagram and a Reels take, in terms of what does it mean to actually be fortified? And how does fortification help out in terms of alleviation of diseases, where people who are trying to follow this clean eating will specify to avoid fortified foods, even though fortified foods can have a positive impact on overall health. And how can we utilize the guidelines for NOVA? How can we utilize the guidelines for HEI so that we can better develop a eating pattern, where the idea here is not simply just limiting the processed foods that are being consumed, but what type of processed foods are there, and the relationship of processed foods to all other foods that are being consumed. It's not just because I'm eating processed foods, I'm automatically going to have a quote unquote bad diet or a quote unquote unhealthy diet. It's what is the relationship of the processed foods to all of the other foods that I'm eating, and can I afford to eat less processed foods, with the understanding that the more processed foods I'm having, the more likely that I am to being exposed to those metabolic disruptive chemicals, where it's not simply avoiding the cookies, avoiding the potato chips, avoiding the low calorie, low fat products, avoiding the packaged foods, avoiding the sugary breakfast cereals, avoiding the cookies, avoiding the processed meats, avoiding the packaged frozen foods. It's not simply just about avoiding those foods. It's about understanding how all of those foods are going to come into the totality of everything that's going to contribute to my overall health. Where one component of that may not be the kind of end all be all of, is my diet healthy or not? Going back to what we've talked about previously, which is missed in the article as well as in the synopsis news article about the review article. What's missing in there, in the idea that is kind of guiding everything here, is that all of the ideas, all of the summaries are based off of the calorie and the caloric density within the foods, without taking into account the actual nutrient densities and the nutritional balance that the person has. When we start looking at the nutritional balance that the person has, the processing of the foods has some degree of action within the healthiness of the diet. But if we focus solely on the caloric densities that's within the foods, we miss out on, is the person actually meeting their nutrient balance as relates to maintenance of healthy tissues, maintenance of fat-free tissues. Overexposure to specific types of nutrients will have a metabolic effect on adipose tissue, and metabolic effects on adipose tissue will impact overall levels of inflammation and stem me towards the fatness side of the continuum of fitness and fatness, which increases my relative risk for non-communicable disease, even if I'm not eating processed foods. Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully you got a little bit out of this idea about the processed foods and how processed foods can impact the healthiness of my diet and what actually leads to the idea about a healthy diet versus an unhealthy diet, and what you can bring into the conversation with a healthcare provider as relates to developing a healthy diet. If you have questions or comments about what was being presented, please make sure to leave that for us. We're more than happy to continue the discussion, possibly expand this discussion into a greater discussion. A lot of the topics that were addressed here, we went into detail in previous discussions, as well as within the book that was just published, Dogmatic Diets. Please make sure you get that and check it out in terms of getting an understanding about different types of dietary approach and how the dietary approach actually align with our understandings of metabolism and understandings of health, and how dietary practices can help us out with establishing our overall health. Please make sure that you're subscribed. Please make sure that you're giving us that big 5-star rating, giving us a big thumbs up, telling us that you like what we're putting out there. Share with all of your friends and family everything that we're putting out. Make sure you're subscribed to here on the podcast as well as on YouTube, the written stuff on Substack, as well as the quick takes that you can find on Instagram and on Threads. Links are in the description if you want to subscribe. Please stay tuned for more discussions on all of the misconceptions that we have about how the human body works, as well as more exposés on healthiness and how we can go about using diet and exercise and lifestyle interventions to become more healthy.